Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this roundtable to talk about the Spanish economy. In these times, extraordinary times with COVID and all the uncertainty, it's good to have the insight from different experts to see what can be the future or what are the forecasts. Let me introduce you the people who are here with me. We have José Luis Curbelo, CEO of Cofides, the state company that is in charge to help Spanish companies to invest internationally. And now it's very focused on helping these mid-sized companies to deal with the crisis generated by COVID. We have also Raymond Torres, Director of Macroeconomy and International Analysis of FUNCAS, one of the main think tanks in Spain. Also, we have Enrique Gutiérrez, partner of Deloitte, welcome, and Ricardo Martínez, head of Equipo Económico, a professional law firm. From Paris, I think we have Frédéric Pretet, Chief Economist of BNP Paribas. Hello, Frédéric. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Yes? Hello.
Yes,
there you are.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Welcome to Madrid virtually. Okay, so let's start. I think we can start with a little bit presentation of a different point of view of our experts. I don't know, maybe, Frédéric, since you are from France, maybe you can start with giving us some ideas of what is going on and what could happen.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry not to be present with you once again this year. We are quite optimistic regarding the development in terms of economy for Spain and for Europe for this years. As you mentioned, the beginning is still a tricky period because we have to deal with the new restriction because of the COVID crisis. We have to deal also with the energy crisis and the high trend in terms of inflation. So the energy crisis is also impacting household purchasing power currently. And in this context, we could not exclude the risk to have a slight contraction in terms of GDP growth in the first months of the years for Europe as a whole. But I would say that if we look to our forecast, in 2021, we had around 5% growth forecast for Europe and around 4 or slightly a bit above this, but around 4 for Spain. For 2022, we'll play this scenario, but in reverse. We look for 4% Europe, so still above potentials, and 5% for Spain. Our positive view is back in with a number of elements. First of all, the vaccination is still efficient with the new variant, so we could expect that this new restriction will be relatively short-lived, and there will be a reopening of the economy in few weeks or few months' time. That's true for Europe, but that's also true for the global economy. The vaccination is improving everywhere, especially in Asia. So that's the good news for the global recovery going on this year. And you know that Europe usually outperforms when there is the global economy is performing well because we have a high openness rate. So that's something which is a good news. It's also a good news for maybe easing the tension on the supply chain. And that's a good news, especially for Spain, because among Europe, of course, there is Germany, Eastern country, but Spain is also very sensitive to supply chain tension and disruption in terms of production. So that's something which weighed on Spanish economy last year's, and we could expect maybe a catch-up for this year. The second point also is regarding consumption. Household excess saving is relatively high everywhere. In all countries, it's around maybe 10% of disposable income. So that means that you have an excess demand which is still pending and which would be relatively helpful also for this year. The third point is in terms of financial condition. We all know that all central banks are normalizing the monetary policy. Of course, it's relatively quick in the US, a bit slower in Europe. But nonetheless, rates are gradually moving on the upside. But the level of interest rate is still very, very low compared to the dynamic in terms of global growth. So that means that the financing condition for capital good investment is still very strong, and that's something which already performed well, because when you look to the capital goods recovery this year was impressive, even in Spain, and this dynamic should continue. That should continue to support employment growth. That's good for households' confidence. Another point is the investment cycle, the inventory cycle. It's very unusual at these times of the recovery. Usually, when you have a recovery, you have a boost from an inventory cycle, and actually it didn't happen. So that means that the inventory cycles that we traditionally see on the recovery are still to play, and that's something which should help, of course, the momentum. And the last point is the fiscal policy. You know that the fiscal rules in Europe are still in a situation that they are not back to any tightening process. They're still suspended. So it means that there is no fiscal shock that could disrupt the recovery this year. In Spain, you have, in addition to this, now the recovery funds is implementing. So that's something which is relatively also a good environment for the growth dynamic. So that's why we're relatively confident regarding this dynamic in terms of recovery for this year. I will just touch a word on inflation, because that's something which is, of course, impacting the sentiment right now. We reached 5% in Europe, around 7% in December in Spain. We believe that this year we'll see a deceleration of inflation. So that means that we could also have a little bit of easing pressures on household purchasing powers going forwards, and that's something which could be, of course, an additional support.
Thanks, Frederic. Enrique, what is your analysis of the situation?
Thank you, Cristina. Good afternoon. My first comment is that I share the optimism of Frederic when I think about the Spanish economic situation. First comment I will make is the impact we had as a consequence of COVID and restrictions was severe. I mean, an 11% contraction is a high contraction. But when we analyze the reaction that our society and our economy had, there are interesting elements of optimism. One is our society reacted very positively because the society accepted restrictions and accepted vaccination. So today, having 90% of vaccination compared to our European average that must be in the range of 70% gives us a very strong protection against any future problem. And second thing, when we think about our business community and when we analyze the evolution of our companies, the net destruction of companies has only been of 1%. I mean, we only lost in net effect 40,000 companies, and very much concentrated in a number of sectors. Also, when we check the average quality situation of the portfolios of the credit portfolios of our banks, default rates have remained quite stable compared to 2019. As of today, 4.5%, that's the average more or less, which gives us hope for optimism on the rhythm of recovery. And that, together with the economic policies, have taken us where we are. And we are in the middle, or perhaps at the beginning, of a recovery phase. We can discuss whether the recovery is below expectations or above expectation. I think that's not really the question. I mean, but growing at around 4.5% in last year, 5.4 as an expectation for this year, something around 4% for 2023, and around 2% for 2024. That's a pretty long period of strong growth as an expectation, as an agreed expectation. And there are some elements, and some were referred by Frederic, that will support this recovery and may even accelerate it. One is the accumulated savings that was referred even yesterday when we had the governor of the Bank of Spain. The quantification of that might be in the range of 60,000. At some point, when we have the right conditions of certainty and trust in the future, that will partially flow into consumption, and that will help recovery. We have the European Next Gen funds. I'm sure we will be talking about those funds in these panels, and they should flow into the economy in 2022 and 2023. So that should be an engine for further growth. Having said that, we have some uncertainties in front of us. I don't think we must underestimate those uncertainties. And just to mention 2-3 things, one is we are in the middle of wave number 6, and we don't know when this is going to happen, and this has an impact. And this has an impact because some decisions get delayed, because this may impact the prospect for the recovery of tourism into the country this year. That might get delayed with a consequence, etc. Then we have inflation, that was referred to by Frederic as well, and inflation and what we call the bottlenecks. That's having an impact. We still believe that will be temporary, but we shouldn't rule out completely the possibility that that becomes more permanent, that it takes longer, and that it somehow penetrates into the consumer prices and salary circle with consequences. Final comment from my side: when you see that employment data behaves better than economic data, then the productivity topic comes to the table again. And I think what we have in front of us is a recovery opportunity, but it is not a quantitative question. I mean, it's not a question of catching up with the business activity we lost before the crisis and continue to do what we did in 2019, but what we have in front of us is a challenge for a deep transformation of our economy to make it more productive, to make it more competitive for the future.
Mm-hmm. Raimon, do you think you're that optimistic, or do you see any shadows, or how do you see the thing?
Yes, I very much agree with the two previous interventions by Federica and Enrique that Spain is heading towards a pretty good year. And I think also I will very much agree with all the factors that they mentioned, but I would add a differential element in favor of Spain vis-à-vis other European countries. And in particular, one very important factor is the question of export performance. I mean, it's quite remarkable that actually, despite the disappearance of tourism in the year 2020 and still very slow progress, a very slow rebound in tourism in 2021, Spain managed to maintain an external surplus, which was one of the hard-won results of the previous expansionary period, and it has been maintained. And this is because export of goods, which is, as you know, there is a shifting global demand towards goods vis-à-vis services, and Spain has managed to take opportunity of this. And indeed, if you look at export performance of the 10 months of this year for which we have data, it's over 20% increase, which is the highest increase among all European countries, even faster than the German engine, export engine. And exports are at a higher level already than the pre-crisis situation. So you can see in terms of export performance, you can see that also in terms of foreign direct investment, it has increased, and it's also reaching the 2019 level, which was a historical year in terms of foreign direct investment. So export performance, competitiveness, if you want, is a differential element in Spain vis-à-vis some other European countries. For example, France has an external trade problem, an external imbalance problem. Other countries grow little from the point of view of external trade. It's not the case of Spain, I mean, at least so far. Mm-hmm. The second differential element has to do with the labor market. And actually, it's the first time since there is a crisis in Spain that the unemployment rate has hardly increased at all. I think all the projections by all of us here and also by the Bank of Spain, OECD, etc., we proved overly pessimistic in the sense that because of the various employment policies which were used in other European countries, Spain managed to contain the impact of the crisis on unemployment. But actually what is more remarkable, that was in a way to be expected to some extent. What is much more remarkable, and is also a differential element of Spain vis-à-vis other European countries, is that the recovery phase is actually very much job-rich, to the point that, as Enrique says, there is an issue of productivity, but at least in the short term, it is a fact that unemployment is probably very close to pre-crisis level, and our projection for 2022 is that the unemployment rate will go below the pre-crisis level. We don't think the labor market reform will change that very much. There will be issues in terms of job quality and so on we can discuss. But I think the quantitative dynamics will probably remain, and that will be an element in addition in favor of Spain. The third element is that the pent-up demand, the excess savings which has characterized all developed world, that people have saved much more than normally because of the crisis, actually has been more in Spain than in other countries. Precisely, this is one reason why 2021 was somewhat disappointing, that consumers didn't spend so much of these excess savings as was predicted, but actually on the positive side, it means that there is more to be spent in 2022 as a result. Our estimate is that there is a possibility of 50 billion euro of excess savings, which is ready to be spent, and that depends on confidence and a number of factors, but vaccination is another very important one, and so on. So these are three elements which differentiate Spain positively vis-à-vis other European countries. That says, as you say, there are indeed some shadows, and I would say the most important from the point of view of Spain is probably inflation, and this itself has to do a lot with the energy crisis and the energy transition, which is going to last much more than this year or next. It's going to be a long-term process, and it turns out that it has an overwhelming impact in Spain. It has a multiplier impact, negative impact in Spain in terms of inflation, and that's a negative, obviously. So this will require a number of reforms and also will require a number of investments in order to reduce dependency on fossil fuels, invest in renewable energy and so on. That's the importance of European funds, of course, the Next Generation EU. The other big risk has to do with the kind of health crisis itself, to the extent the Omicron spreads. That could have also because the recovery depends so much on export performance, we don't know to what extent, for example, the 1+ billion Chinese people are immunized against these new variants because of the vaccination they had, which is a major unknown. If this has a result on closing a number of producer sites and therefore intensify some of the bottlenecks in some parts of the world, this can have a major impact in Spain as well. So there are some big shadows, of course, as well.
Ricardo, how do you see the year we have just started now?
As you have also introduced us, I think we are still living in extraordinary conditions, but in a much better shape than we began last year. You may remember that we were here. It was just after an impressive storm, snowstorm, which obviously affected the economy, which hasn't been the case these days, you know. So I'm relatively optimistic. The economy has had a good performance last year, not as expected, but better than expected in terms of job creation. Obviously, we have to add that many jobs have also been created by the public sector, which has also to be introduced in the equation. But the economy, will have grown at the rate of something like 4.5%, and we expect the economy to do much better this year, this 2022. Favorable arguments and lights are, in my opinion, obviously the vaccination process, which makes that we have been very keen to accept vaccines, but also the financial capacity of the Spanish economy. You, Raymond, have mentioned that. We are still running a current account, a positive current account, a surplus in terms of our current account. This is the 9th year which that happens. And this hasn't happened in all those last economic cycles. This means that our economy has the financial resources it needs to create wellness, to create wealth. And this is still the case. So this is a very positive argument which backs our projections of our economy doing pretty well this year. Having said that, obviously, there are external arguments, external issues which influence our economic performance. The pandemic, international economic growth, our export markets. If they do well, we will increase our exports. That's obvious. But there are also domestic factors which can improve our economy and the way we recover from the past crisis and the way we challenge all those difficulties we will have in the future. Having said that, these internal capacities, these internal drivers are very much linked to the reforms which are being introduced in our economy, and to the generation of expectations and confidence of these reforms. And therefore, I think that major issues related to the labor market reform, to the recently also reform which has been approved related to our pension system, to the announced fiscal reform, these are very important issues which affect the business community. In my view, having said that the financial capacity which the economy has is the most impressive and the most positive argument to think that the economy will have a very positive economic performance. I may also add, obviously, the impact of the European funds, where you have also to consider that executing these funds, it's not easy. We are always, these past 2 years, we have been really optimistic in the way we think these funds can be executed, and it's not so easy. And we have a large history of these last 20, 25 years where we have seen that with very important infrastructure projects in our country, it's not so easy to effectively invest all this huge amount of money. But I think major risks, having said these very optimistic points, major risks are related to still the huge and the high unemployment rate. And although the labor market which has been announced, the labor market reform which has been announced, which still has to be passed in our Congress, has a positive understanding because it has been achieved in a compromise by the social agents. I think it reduces the flexibility of our labor market, and we need flexibility to challenge all those structural reforms. So unemployment, first shadow, high unemployment rate. Inflation, the second one, which is already mentioned by our partners. And the third one is the public deficit. I think we need to really challenge the issue of reducing the public deficit by reducing expenditures, not by announcing tax hikes, which has been the case during all these last 2 and 3 years. And not only announcing tax hikes, but also introducing hikes in not the most appropriate moment to do so. Mm-hmm. Let's say a very small tax hike affecting the automotive sector, a very small one, but it has been introduced just now in January. A very small tax hike affecting the Spanish real estate investment trusts, but it has been introduced, it has been also introduced last year. A major tax change affecting dividends of our investments abroad has also been introduced. I think this is not to speak about indirect taxes with the inflation rate we have now, or the income tax. When we have had record revenues in terms of the income tax this last year, 2021, compared to 2019, a record high figure in terms of revenues. So my view is that I think we have the capacity, we will grow, we will have a better year than 2021, but it is also our capacity to make it better. And therefore, we need reforms which are also being demanded by the investment community, by the investors from abroad.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. José Luis, you are very close and work very close to companies and help them how to deal with the COVID crisis. Are they suffering very much?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Well, certainly the companies are suffering, but one of the important things that we are seeing is that the fund that was created by the government to help medium-sized companies affected by COVID have a demand that is much more reduced than we thought was going to be at the beginning. The fund that we call FONREC is a fund that invests, is aiming to strengthen the capital structure of medium-sized companies affected by COVID, and defining medium-sized companies, those that have sales between 10 million and 400 million euros in 2019. It's a segment of enterprises that is not very big in the Spanish scenario. There are only 20,000 companies with sales between 10 and 400 million euros, but it's a segment of enterprises that is extremely important in the Spanish economy. Actually, they represent only 0.7% of the Spanish enterprises, but they create between 18 and 20% of the employment. And they produce around 8-9% of the gross national product. So it's a segment of enterprises that I will say is a very good indicator of the strength of our economic tissue, of our enterprise tissue. The fund was created with 1 billion euros, and the last data that we have that was closed the last 11th, we had only a demand of 600 million euros, and very highly concentrated in a few sectors. So it means that the economic crisis for this segment of enterprises that is important because all the data that I have given, but also because they subcontract smaller enterprises, they hire and they contract autonomous people, and they also are those that subcontract the productive service sector. So it's a segment very important for the value added that they generate. And the demand is not being very high. And it's not because the terms for the eligibility are extremely restrictive. They are not. It's only that the company is in a crisis situation, has deteriorated their sales vis-a-vis the year 2019. So what we see is a demand that is lower than we expected, highly concentrated in those activities very much linked with togetherness, with being together, restaurants, transportation, and even the industrial activities that are having problems are those that are very much linked to the sector of mobility. So in this sense, I share the optimism that the colleagues have in respect to the performance of the Spanish economy, of the Spanish enterprises. It doesn't mean that the companies are not suffering. Of course they are suffering. Of course they are adjusting. Of course all of them had to tie their belt. But I will say that with the instruments that were put in place by at the beginning of the crisis with the eco lending structures, also with the furlough support through the ERTEs, and so on and so forth, the companies have been able to handle out the situation. So I share the optimism, and I think the companies will, many of them are in the process of restructuring, in the process of being more productive, and I am relatively optimistic and confident that the situation, if we don't have, as you have said, other waves and other situations that continue putting us in a situation of, keeping us in the situation of crisis.
Okay. This year should be key for the recovery plan. As you said, it's not easy to spend that much money properly. And I would like to know your opinion, maybe from the more macro point of view, that what kind of impact could have, and if there are any issues that maybe concern the community about how is this going to be deployed, because the beginning was very low. I don't know how you see that. And maybe after you have contact with many companies, maybe how they can take advantage of these recovery funds.
Yes, indeed. The speed at which the next generation funds were spent has been slow because it really started late, the program, it has to be said. Plus, of course, many procedures and management rules had to be put in place, so it has slowed the process. According to our analysis, which covers the 11th first month of the entire year except the month of December, around 7 billion euro have been spent on account of next generation funds. That said, December was probably an exceptional month, probably many more projects were admitted and so on. If you look at manifestations of interest and so on, it's probably the case. So probably last year we have around 10 billion euro will have been spent on account of these funds. This is, almost half the amount that was predicted or budgeted, I would say. So I mean, the start was low, but I think it's gaining speed. So the real issue now, in terms of what you ask, which is what is going to be the impact on the Spanish economy, is not so much the quantity of the funds, but rather the type of projects which are accepted and so on. So in that sense, I think what is crucial is to observe within the next generation funds, to observe those projects that have to do with the public-private partnerships. There are 7 such mega projects. One of them is the electric engine, and there's one for aerospace and agriculture, the agro-food sector as well, and so on. These are very important because these are potentially the most transformative of all, and these were the latest to start. And so I would say, as a test, we have to observe to what extent these 7 projects are implemented, start to be fully implemented this year according to the plan. This will be a real test of whether the next generation funds are really making a real difference over the long term to the Spanish economy or not. The other element has to do with what was mentioned before, the reforms, because the next generation EU is a mix of, as you know, investment and reforms. And here, I have to say, I didn't expect that so much would happen last year. I think, of course, there are many issues that can be said about the kind of reforms and the content of the reforms, but there's no doubt that a lot has happened. There are 3 very important laws in terms of economic regulations in order to make it easier to compete, to transform the economy and so on. There is a labor market reform, there's something on pensions, and so on and so forth. But I think much more is needed, like on fiscal issues, on energy, especially electricity market, which is a big problem in Spain. So this is the second element to judge whether the European funds will really help in the long term as well. I think these are the 2 main issues that we highlight.
José Luis?
Yeah, I agree with Ricardo when he says that the important thing is, I think public administration, many of us have an important relation with the administration, is very good to perform in normal conditions. Suddenly we have an immense amount of money that has to be properly invested. And that is not easy. That is procedures, transparency, legitimacy, political legitimacy to make the investments are important things that have to be taken care of, especially in a country in which there are certain perception that things are not extremely transparent. So I will say that in this sense, a lot of things have been done, and I think they have been doing very well. I think that I value a lot that all these reform project has been able to identify vectors that have somehow are going to be the focus for the years to come. And I will say that that is very important in a country like us, that I will say that for us always is very difficult. I always say that the strategy means saying no. Strategy means if everything is important, nothing is important. So I think strategy is saying, okay, the main vectors of economic activity for the future, where we want to focus growth, increasing productivity, increases in competitiveness, are going to be these certain elements. Some people will complain that they are not all of them, that some of them should be also included, but if we begin to say, okay, why not this and why this, probably will be losing out a little bit of focus. So I will say that that is important. Also, I will say that one of the important things of the next generation is not only defining focus, but also forcing the cooperation between actors. So individual companies are going to be beneficiaries of resources as long as they are a part of a cooperative agreement with the ecosystem. So it's not individual enterprises who receive money directly, but they receive money as long as they are part not only of a vector of important, but also is part of a cooperative undertaking that is going to result in a public good that is going to be positive for the future. So I will say that I value the most the certainty that we are going to, or that the plan is going to introduce in the market. So I also agree that that is difficult to implement, that is going to take still a while until we see the outcome, but is the opportunity of changing the face of the Spanish productive system.
I think the activity merger and acquisition is one of a good sign of how it's doing the economy. How do you see any investment interest for Spain?
I mean, if M&A is a good thermometer for the activity, M&A is booming at the moment. And it is booming in 2021 after a year in 2020 when it stopped and activities came down very severely. And that is quite understandable because investors prioritize to take care of their investments rather than go after new ones. So 2020 was, the level of activity was very low, and the pickup in 2021 has been extraordinary. And this is something happening globally and also in Spain. Globally, just to give one figure, the market has exceeded the record high of 5 trillion, and I don't know how many zeros has 5 trillion, but that's the very maximum historic in terms of volumes of M&A activity in the world. And that has been concentrated mainly in healthcare and technology. Healthcare is understandable, and technology means that a big part of that investment activity is in the middle of a very fast digital transformation process happening everywhere. Okay? When we come to Spain, the situation is the same. I mean, the market is super busy. And apart from health and technology, it has been busy as well in energy, and it has been busy in financial services. But sectors tend to be more or less the same. When we observe M&A, and we try to extract some trends or some conclusions, we see a number of things. One is a very strong interest and growing interest from the private equity community. Private equity is very strongly participating in M&A. Second, and this could be part of private equity, venture capital is growing much faster than the rest of investors. And this means that in this country, we begin to have a very active environment for entrepreneurship and for innovation and technology development, etc. That's gaining a strong ground. Third comment is the share of international investors. 80% of the M&A activity of the first 9 months of 2020 were made by international investors. And also we observed some interesting developments. For example, a number of very large international investors in the last 9 months have decided, 5 or 6 of them, have decided to set up permanent offices in Spain, which takes you to the conclusion that they've decided to be focused in this market for quite some time. Okay? When you talk to them and you try to understand why there is an interest in the Spanish market, 4 or 5 things tend to repeat. One is a timing question. We mentioned in the earlier question that we are at the beginning of a recovery phase. And that's what investors see. I mean, Spain is at the beginning of several years where extraordinary growth is going to be enjoyed, and therefore there will be a value creation potential for those investments they make. And history tells you that immediately after a shock, immediately after a crisis, those investments you made over there tend in the medium term to become those yielding the highest returns. And they are very aware of this. So there is a timing consideration that will be there for some time, and this is one thing. Second thing is the country requires, and we mentioned this already, a deep transformation. And when it is a question of transformation, then management capacity is needed, and there is an opportunity for value creation, because part of that, you do that through M&A, consolidation, spin-offs, and many of these things. Three, Spain remains as a very attractive destination, even for geographical reasons. Sometimes we are the platform for those that are jumping into other geographies, that could be Latam, or coming from there and jumping into Europe. And that's a very permanent advantage we have, and it is behind some of the movements. And then we have top class, and this is well known by investors, management capacities that attracts the interest for international investors. So my view is all those elements will guarantee, I think, a very active M&A market in the following years. This year will be for sure, but probably same for the years ahead.
Frederic, from Paris, can you confirm this interest from the investors to come to Spain to do business in Spain? How do you see how is perceived Spain now?
Spain is we watch also the management of the Spanish economy and of course the comments made by for example, the European Commissions regarding the different agenda, economic agenda, reform agenda. It is true that from an investor's perspective, the fact that, for example, and come back to the issue regarding the recovery fund, the EU Commissions has delivered to Spain the green line for the recovery fund. That's the first country which has been getting the green line from the EU Commissions and the green line regarding the capacity to implement successfully. Of course, it needs to be confirmed, but over time. But that's something which is a strong benchmark for French investors. That means that the capacity in implementing the recovery fund is well recognized by the EU Commissions. That's a point which is important. And as you know, the impact of public spending on the economy is usually relatively strong. Usually the elasticity, when you put a €1 investment in public investments, usually the elasticity is around the €1 returns for investment. But for the transitions, if it's linked to transition, there is even survey saying it's above €1. So that means that the return you get is strong, and investors know that the country will get the quicker the money, will be able to get the better return the quicker. And there is of course also the idea of and you mentioned just previously on the geographic position of Spain, especially everything linked to the transition. There is a number of studies saying that of course the country which are the most placed to benefit from the transition and to get the most profit from the transition, the climate transition, are usually country when there is a higher capacity to attract the sun. So of course it's more southern countries and countries which are also a coastal country because of the wind power, and that creates for the French perspective Spain in terms of geographic location something which is of course also well recognized. And finally, I would say that there is also a kind of geopolitical sentiments. The relationship between Spain and France, between the governments, is strong since many years. There have been no too much fluctuations. You know that the French President Macron is counting a lot on Spain, but also on Italy, to push the further reforms during the French presidency, which is very important for the coming months. So that creates also an environment in terms of confidence between French investor and Spanish investor, which is relatively high.
One thing to take into account, I think it's fiscal policy. You were saying before that we need to do reforms, but they need to be done properly or okay. One of the big issues this year may be the fiscal reform that the government is thinking about. What do you think about it? Because we know not a lot, but...
Well, you know, the main driver of growth is competition. You know, I do believe in the markets, and I do believe in competition to be the best way to grow, to be innovative, to challenge these excellent entrepreneurs we have. And when we see the structural changes which are happening, some of them being created by the pandemic, but some of them also being created by the digital challenges, our economy and our markets need flexibility. You know, human capital, investors, they are now in the transition of moving from one sectors to others, in challenging new sectors, in challenging new opportunities. And there are a lot of new opportunities in Spain, and there are a lot of very competitive sectors in Spain. And most of them, we see them in our current account. The best way to analyze which sectors are very competitive in our economy is to analyze how well they are doing in terms of the international markets. And we have, obviously, the automotive sector, the agro industry, renewables, infrastructure, tourism, hotels, excellent companies. But they need flexibility to be really able to all these challenges coming from abroad. And in terms of flexibility, we're referring to the labor market. I have also to refer to the capacity to invest in this country. I have to refer to the tax structure because that's also something where competition happens all around the world. When companies want to invest in Spain, and there are excellent cases of companies doing so, they compare our economy towards France, to the German economy, to Poland, to Turkey, to Morocco, to Colombia, and we have to remain competitive. And the fiscal framework and the fiscal frame is a very important tool to be competitive. And when we get the idea that, well, in my view, we have a huge deficit which has to be reduced. We have, again, to show the financial community that we are committed to a balanced budget. There are two ways to doing so. In my view, we have to reduce expenditures. We can't expect taxes to be increased. And so when I try to analyze how the next tax reform will be, I'm trying to say, hey, we have to remain competitive because, well, the income tax, we have extra record collections, as I've said. The indirect tax, we have to be careful with inflation. Corporate tax, hey, see what Portugal is doing or see what Germany is doing. So obviously there are some changes which can be introduced in our economy to better balance our revenue structure. That's right. But be very careful with all those measures you introduce and with all those announcements you make of measures you will introduce, because investors don't expect to take the decision when the law has been passed. They already take the decision when they see that something can be changed. Investors from Latin America, which are very positively coming to Spain, which is also extraordinary news. Not only Spanish companies investing in Latin America, but also Latin American companies and Latin American families investing here in our country. They analyze our tax structure and then they decide. And Portugal is competing against us. So this is why I think measures and announcements which are being made have to be very coherent so as to remain attractive for this excellent investment community and investors from abroad we have here in this country.
Any of you think that the Spanish economy needs to raise more money for the public sector, or that we need a fiscal reform, Raymond?
I think from the point, at least from the macroeconomic point of view, I think what is the most important is to ensure that the possibilities which are embedded into this next generation program are maximized. And for this, we need, among other things, public investment, partly funded by Europe, but also partly internally. And also there are some current expenditures which are needed as well as a result of these. So this is absolutely crucial for the economy to be transformed. And for the rest of the budget, I think the most important is to reach a balance. So somehow, if you want, the current expenditures have to be managed by the current revenues of Spain. At the moment, we have an imbalance. There's a structural deficit. And I think the most important is to reduce that structural deficit on current expenditures vis-à-vis current revenues, which will require some fiscal measures. I believe, according to calculations we have made, that with a reform that reduces the loopholes in the tax system, tax exemptions, and so on, would be a way forward. Another has to do, of course, with some evaluation of expenditure programs, which, of course, can reduce some waste, some overlap between different administrations, and so on. That's also possible, if only with the one of the Next Generation EU program, which is the digitalization of public administration, offers lots of opportunities to achieve that. So I think that's another possibility. But I think, again, it seems to me that we should not forget this perspective, that if we are too harsh on cutting, for example, public investment, we are going to jeopardize this huge opportunity. Remember that public investment had declined to the bare bones of public investment, to the point that in a way the capital stock of Spain was being depleted because not enough investment was done, not only in Spain, but also in countries like Italy and so on, where much of the efforts to reduce the deficit were concentrated on public investment. That would be a mistake, and I believe that it should be possible with these funds to find a new approach to the budget management, so this is maintained looking forward to the future. We have projections ourselves that if that is the case, we can add easily 1 to 1.5 percentage point economic growth every year until the end, practically until the end of the Next Generation program. And this is not taking into account another element of the program, which is recourse to loans. Spain has used transfers, about 70 billion transfers, which were available in the program. And unlike Italy, it has not used the loans which are available. Perhaps it was one in the beginning, but I believe Spain should be ambitious and use these loans in order to speed up the modernization of the country. And for that, we need the budget space for this, which is why the reform of the European fiscal rules is so important. And I think there are several proposals recently by France and Italy that Frederic knows very well, the proposal. But even in Germany, there is interest in at least making an exception in terms of public investment, so it doesn't count as used to be in the past in terms of the European fiscal rules. This would be very important in order to maintain the momentum.
I'm afraid we are running out of time, but I think we can talk a little bit about inflation. You're saying it's one of the main concerns now, and is there the possibility that we will see interest rates rising before expected, and what impact this can be in these levels of debt that the countries have and the companies have, make them doing more vulnerable? I don't know. Do you see any change? Is this possible?
I don't know. I think that talking about inflation is like guessing today. And I think that some of us are divided, all of us are divided between those that think that we will get into a second round effect and those of us that think that probably the second round effects are not going to be so big. I think that probably we will not go to the so low level of inflation that we used to have, but certainly we will moderate the level of inflation for a while. So,
And in terms of interest rates,
well, in
fiscal
terms of
policy,
interest rates, the reaction we are seeing in the central banks, especially in the Federal Reserve, is a more quicker decision than expected a few months ago of intensively reacting to that figures. I think in September, people thought of, well, we'd see what happens at the end of 2022. And now we are already talking about 4 interest hikes in this year, affecting the Federal Reserve. The European Central Bank is still very cautious in saying what it will do. Because my view is that they want to consolidate the economic expansion, and because they also want to see how prices evolve month after month. Will it happen that beginning in March, April, prices will be reduced? Will it happen that countries react very cautiously in the sense that wages are still conservative and we don't use these expectations to now increase wages? Obviously, if wages are being increased, inflation will not be temporary. So, and inflation, answering again your last question, inflation is the most hidden and least transparent tax. Which again helps to answer your question.
Okay, we don't know what is going to happen in the next year. Maybe next year we will see here and can discuss what happened. Okay, I'd like to thank you all for your insights and the audience for attending. And I think we have run out of time now. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
El Rey ha inaugurado esta mañana la 7ª edición del Spain Investors Day.
Madrid acoge la 4ª edición del Spain Investors Day.
Con empresarios se va a reunir hoy el rey Felipe VI en la 7ª edición del Spain Investors Day.